before we start a discussion, I wanted to put a very general question out there, but that kind of reflects the moment that we're in. There's a war happening essentially an hour and 30 minutes away from here. There was this notion for many years, which I'm wondering if you share or you don't, but this idea that the more connected, global, interconnected the world would be, the economy, trade, and all of this would be together, that we would avoid situations like this. Clearly, now it's not happening, and everything has changed in a way that's very dramatic. And of course, we think of the people of Ukraine and everything they go through every day in this ordeal. So is the system now broken? Are we heading into a new form of global economy? But nonetheless, we see that there is a huge separation now happening between countries, like Mr. Lindner said, that perhaps follow the rules and others that don't. Mariana, if you wish to start.
Sure. I mean, I come to it as an economist, and I've been arguing for some time that in order to actually work together, to collaborate, to actually have solidarity, we need a concept within economics around the common good. And I don't think we have it. And I must say that as inspirational as Chancellor Scholz's speech was, he got kind of nailed by the question about intellectual property rights. And that's one of the issues. If we actually want to collaborate, if we want to build the capacity that he said, rightly so, that we need in the global south, then we cannot continue to allow the intellectual property rights to be abused. It's not about being against intellectual property rights. It's about governing innovation towards the common good. Currently, even pre-COVID, our patents are too upstream. So we're actually privatizing the tools for research. They're too wide because they're just used for strategic reasons, and they're too strong, hard to license. That's a bad way to govern patents. So if we want that kind of solidarity that he talked about, it has to go to the center of how we produce. It can't just be about kind of ex post philanthropy and charity. And currently how we do capitalism is incredibly problematic. But to do that then kind of seriously, to walk the talk of stakeholder value, that really means getting our hands dirty with how we change our production systems towards common good, towards patent pools during a pandemic, but also the whole question of how do we govern who pays for the current situation around energy prices. It can't just be left to kind of, each country fighting it out. We need concepts around that. And I don't want to keep talking because I realize we have so little time in this session.
And I have follow-ups already, so actually, Robert, if you will.
It is clear that the system that we have historically worked under, including the concepts of global trade, is broken, is not fit for purpose, is going to change going forward. The business community would tell you, I still need to trade internationally. It's not going to be as global as it once was. I'm going to be more bilateral and multilateral than ever before. And to the point that was made, the system historically, focusing on what I'll call short-term economic interests, now has to transition itself to more responsible capitalism or more stakeholder capitalism with a broader agenda. But that means that we got to connect more dots. It's easy for a country to make a claim that they will be net zero in the Paris Accords by X. But if the business community isn't doing it, that commitment is useless. Likewise, we've got to commit. What does it mean for government, for business, the consumers, and the citizens of the world? Because each one has a role to play. We can't just pin this on the government and what the Chancellor ultimately said earlier on today. And last but not least, everything we're talking about has a societal implication. So connecting those dots becomes extremely important as well. The one thing I will agree on, though, which came from the finance minister, there is plenty of capital that exists today in the world to solve for some of these challenges. What we're not doing a good job at is identifying how to match that capital versus the opportunity for real impact. And I will tell you from the studies we've done, the sponsors are not great in terms of getting ready for that capital, attracting it and warranting it. And likewise, we're doing a lousy job of applying lessons learned to get scale, speed, and a higher ambition out there in terms of the changes that are needed.
But I wonder, just as a follow-up, and I'm sure you want to comment because I could see you. Do you want to respond?
Well, just
before we...
The whole capital question. There is plenty of finance out there, but finance isn't neutral. Right? The structure of finance matters. I do innovation economics, and the fact we had all this impatient venture capital that was exit-driven, that wanted to exit in 3 or 5 years through an IPO or a buyout, screwed over the biotech sector. And now we're doing it again in the space sector. So in a moment where we need to finance green, what kind of finance? How do we have patient, long-term, committed finance? And what sort of conditionalities? We no longer need the conditionalities of the World Bank and the IMF, at least the historic ones, which are actually those that help to reduce the capacity in the global south, if you looked at what it did to fiscal capacity. We need the kind of conditionalities that actually we had in Germany recently, one really good example, that because there's an Energiewende policy, the loan that was provided by the KfW, the local public bank, the National Public Bank, to the steel sector, which also Schultz mentioned, was conditional on steel lowering its material content. It wasn't just money given out because steel is having problems globally. The French finance minister made the French COVID recovery scheme conditional on companies like Air France and Renault committing to lowering their carbon emissions. In Denmark and Austria, conditions attached to stop using tax havens. It's not rocket science, but that's an exception. That's not currently how finance is given. So it's really important to talk about the structure and the governance of the finance, not just the quantity.
Correct.
You make a very good point, but I want to, Elena, before we move on to, well, the many follow-ups that I have, from Consumer International, the role of consumer here is always super important. But I wonder in this context, and one thing that really caught my eye, especially in this context of the war in Ukraine, is that we saw consumers who actively said, I'm not going to buy this product, or I'm not going to work with this other company. And one particular case that caught my eye was Nestle. This was a company that was bashed for weeks, and eventually had to U-turn because of this. So how important is this consumer behavior? And what do they want, actually? What is it behind a product?
Yeah, so I'm here partly talking about the role of the consumer in this whole situation, also as an NGO. And if you start from the transition we need to talk about, let's take one example, the IEA net zero for 2050. If you look in there, 55% of the change is technology, but actively driven by consumers. Another 8% is consumers themselves making a shift. So the first tranche is, I buy an electric vehicle. That's already a big shift, right? The 8% comes from, I don't take the plane. So the role of the consumer here is absolutely crucial, and we need to talk in a more serious way about that, because you either have this expectation that consumers are going to sort of be dark green or boycott or shift the market. Many can, and many have to, but many can't. And then you start getting into this sort of, let's help the market, let's support them, let's make it easy. It's got to be both of those, so we get to a tipping point that's fast. Now, I come from a sort of quite an unusual organization. It's an NGO. We're a network of 200 consumer NGOs in 100 countries. So the lady from Sudan, my council member is in Sudan, in Fiji, in India, in Rwanda, not just in the US or in Europe or in Australia. And what is incredible is, regardless of whether you talk about stakeholder or shareholder capitalism, regardless of what kind of legislation you're talking about, there are actually consumer essential needs defined at the United Nations. And did anybody here who did an MBA, myself included, ever hear about those? But could they be a really sort of valuable lens to see how we build, including the sort of sectoral approach? That's about not just access, not just inclusivity, vulnerability. It's not just about economic needs. It's not just about safety. It includes information. It includes education about your consumer rights. It includes redress, representation, and then the promotion of sustainable consumption patterns, privacy, e-commerce rights. And we've done this sort of, I'll end here, we've done a recent sort of attempt at an index to see, well, how are we doing on those? I don't know what a 53% grade would be in Mariana or Rachel's classes, but I suspect it could do better at the very least. And there are certain indicators of where we can build better. All of these are sources of innovation and improvement that build that trust for consumers in the marketplace. So I don't think it's back to the single, it's not about a knee-jerk reaction, it's a consistent, long-term, effective build around the high street, the marketplace that you talk about, Mariana, in your book. Sort of let's look at those relationships over time and that the handshake is strong.
And you mentioned EC, and to me that's interesting because I remember at COP26 there was a lot of people who were super passionate about these new products and wanted to be sustainable and kind of engage with it. But then they all said, when I go buy something, I have no clue what it means. Oh. I can't read the tag. It's so difficult, and I'm willing to spend more, but I just don't know if what I buy is sustainable. I don't get it. Right. Is it because companies fail? Or the whole global conversation fails around the education?
We need a marketing revolution.
Yes.
I mean, every single way, the way in which you are taught about marketing is let's find data and understand and then So, I mean, it's mean to say that. There is an entirely different way in which we can be engaging with a consumer. Right now, you're entirely right. There are about 300 labels out there just for how you recycle your plastic packaging. We are, a child, there's a great study in New Zealand. They put a camera on kids going to school. 77 times the kids saw ads or some sort of marketing for unhealthy foods. That's 2/3 times more than you actually get decent information about nutrition. So you need a revolution in information to start with, and then I can go on to redress, enforcement, and a couple of other points. Absolutely.
If I can, we as an organization, just thinking about the GSS Summit, have historically talked about government and business and not enough about the consumer and the citizens of the world. So I wholeheartedly endorse the concept of there's an education and an empowerment issue to build the case for change. It goes to two other things that has to happen. One is what I'll call the standards of information that should be actually provided to those citizens of the world and the consumers ultimately, and the trust that they have within it. And there's got to be more of a demand on the business, and yes, maybe even enforced by government through rules and regulations in terms of how do I get more trust in the system to have the impact that we're looking for. This is not going to happen without the consumer involved, as we sit here today.
And to me, it was very clear, COP. People are willing to pay more, but they just don't know where to put their money. So
yes and no. Let's be honest. We've got a number of people that say, yes, I'm willing to pay, but in reality, maybe not, because I don't even understand how much more I'm paying and for what am I getting that for. So I think there's another element to the, am I willing to pay the premium? What's the premium really for?
What's the premium? That's the and Rachel, before we kind of move into the next stage of the discussion, I guess the question now is, given everything that's happening in the world right now, do you fear that a lot of this conversation is going to get kind of sidetracked? That all of the big goals, well, right now it seems that there may be other more pressing issues?
Yeah, I think it's always a challenge to get politicians and politics and policy to focus on the longer term challenges. We always tend as human beings to focus on the near term. I think in particular, I want to come back to the point of innovation, which inevitably is a long-term issue, right? We need innovation to address many of the issues we've talked about here, and everything from improvements in global supply chains to climate change, which is a big focus of this group. But that inevitably means thinking long term. And I agree with the rest of the panel that our current systems of incentivizing innovation just really aren't working very well. And often it's portrayed as a very kind of black and white, controversial, intellectual property versus, everything open. And that fight is really not an effective way to address the issue of promoting innovation. And there are actually solutions, which maybe we can get into, which allow us to encourage innovation in a way that also makes sure that the conditions of getting money for innovation is that you share the final innovation as broadly as possible.
I can hear you go, so.
Oh, sorry.
what do you want? No, but what do you, I'm sure you want to add something on this.
Just two quick things, if I can, just on consumers. I mean, like another way to talk about consumers, a bit kind of more boring, is to talk about demand. And the Minister, Lindner, talked about supply, but the demand side, diffusion, deployment of innovations, once they come out, actually require really bold government policy. Like in the mass production revolution, it would have had no effect on production, distribution, and consumption without suburbanization. And I'm not an architect, so I don't know if suburbanization was a good idea. I grew up in New Jersey, probably not a good idea. But anyway, it was that demand pull, for all these washing machines, cars, and dishwashers to actually get diffused. Green today, the green revolution, I'm speaking at the Energy Summit tomorrow, should also be seen as the demand pull, precisely to have that kind of scaling up effect, not only in terms of consumers, but also all these small companies. There's no point in having startups and small companies if they can't scale up. So that kind of procurement strategy, but also the reason that something like 30% of Tesla cars were until recently sold in Norway was that you paid no tax on them. You could drive on the taxi lane to get to the airport, and you paid nothing for parking in the center of town, right? So those kind of consistent, coherent, systemic demand-side policies to reward both consumers and companies doing the right thing. That's about tilting the playing field. All this vocabulary about leveling the playing field, get rid of it. If you want green, inclusive, sustainable growth, you need to tilt it to reward kind of actions that are at least steering in the right direction. In terms of innovation, one of the interesting things, just coming back to the pharmaceutical companies and kind of health, is one of the first things we need to do is kind of debunk the narrative of where innovation comes from. Everything, I wrote a whole book about it, I don't have my iPhone with me, but everything that makes our smartphones smart and not idiotic was actually funded by governments. Internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri. Then we needed really smart companies like Apple to do all this great stuff, which they did do, with senses of simplicity and design to make these wonderful products. But without that government-funded technology in the really early, high-risk stage, capital-intensive stage, there would have been nothing to put together into the smart products. So the question, I think, going forwards, especially with green innovation, is what are that kind of like ex-ante, pre-distributive conditions and governance mechanisms so we don't ex post have to just kind of regulate, redistribute, worry about taxation, worry about privacy. Those conditions should be put in the investment in the first place. And I think this idea that patents are just kind of pro or against patents, it comes, I agree with you. It's not about being for or against patents. It's how do we govern innovation in such a way that begins with the fact that innovation is collectively created. Wealth is collectively created. How do we share both in the risks and the rewards, instead of doing what so many governments have done, which is socialize, risks and then privatize profits. It really makes little sense. And it's not about being anti-company. It's also about being much more confident about the deal. And given that the language of the New Deal, the Green Deal is out there, the green bit, as Greta says, just follow the scientists, the deal needs a new social contract.
So, and I wonder, it's funny because what you say, I hear this all the time, particularly in a place like Berlin, where there's many great ideas, but a lot of these startups will tell you we just don't have the capacity to majorly scale up, or we're behind in ways that perhaps would incentivize, a lot of our business, and we're not there yet. Is there an issue with regulation? Is there a problem in Europe?
Well, the reason that so many, again, it comes back to what I talked about in the entrepreneurial state, without DARPA, without the National Institutes of Health, but also without the Small Business Innovation Research Program in the US, which sets that every government department has to use 3% of its budget to procure in innovative solutions from small, medium enterprises, that's a scaling up tool. So this myth that Europe has great universities, but then has a hard time commercializing, so all it needs is venture capital, is like, no, it just also needs a much more ambitious, interesting partner through the public sector, which Silicon Valley had. What Silicon Valley did really badly was the distribution of those gains, which were collectively created. Again, we ended up privatizing the profits in a really naive way, and I think there's enough of us calling that out right now. But what we haven't had in Europe is a lot of that kind of early stage public funds, which then allowed small companies to even have a market. Most venture capital funds went in after the SBIR program. It's a myth that VCs invest in the early stage. It's either business angels, friends and family. Most of us don't have rich friends from family, or government.
There's two things that we have found over time are getting in the way of scaling that innovation. Forget the financial turns on the back end. Number one is, how do you get the capital into those institutions as quickly as possible? And governments are ill-equipped to do that in terms of the identification of those innovations, as well as deploying the capital in terms of the pros and cons of where to deploy. And the second is actually the lessons learned of the policies, procedures, and mechanisms. And what we have right now is governments trying to figure this out each individually, as well as doing it in silos. So there's no subject matter expertise for scalability sitting in the government right now. They're always looking for help or trying to recreate the wheel. And that's where actually the combination of the consumer, the government, the business, and I'm going to go to one other group we haven't talked about yet, which is the youth of this world. If we're not bringing the youth into that equation, you'll miss the innovation that we talked about as well. And I think there's got to be examples and replicable examples around the world to exemplify what we're talking about here. A good example right now is in India, where they're actually having a number of things that are focused on. There's a concept of how do I actually upskill the citizens of the country? How do I incent entrepreneurship? Once I find those innovations, how do I scale them as quickly as possible? And that's where the government's actually putting policy in place to try to figure out a way to do that for not only benefiting the domestic agenda, but also India's role in the world today.
And this is interesting to me. When you mentioned the youth, who do you have in mind? Is there someone out there that you think, okay, this is I can think of perhaps Greta. But if you talk about that, well, it's very controversial.
There's people in the audience here. I mean, any youth with a great idea is struggling with, how do I get my idea launched, scaled, and exemplified in such a way that I can bring it to life? And we got to actually bring them into the partnership when we're talking about the change we're trying to drive here.
And would you agree with that? And then about perhaps the young consumers, but also not just the young consumer, but the young kind of creators?
There are two thoughts that come to me. One was we recently talked about a different sector, digital finance, and young people are more than others in there. Two phenomena, one cryptocurrency, the other one buy now, pay later. These are two areas which have grown really rapidly, are now global phenomena, and this is where regulation, so that we don't throw out the sort of the baby with the bathwater, let's remember what we've learned in terms of consumer protection, because each of those areas are disrupting the sector in really interesting ways, and yet, cryptocurrency, your redress, getting your money back when it's gone, impossible. Buy now, pay later, that is now being used for essential goods and services rather than just the sort of, something I might like to buy. I think there's something about setting the rules up front that we don't rush into innovation without remembering what we've learned about consumer protection on this, so that make it safe for individuals. And these came up from young consumer advocates themselves. This is a really exciting area. I think the future of thinking about our economy comes from people sort of within NGOs and civil society now thinking about the economy. Having said that, we've got the innovation to get us to 2030. We don't have the innovations to get us to net zero in 2050. So finding that balance and some of the sort of sandbox approaches that we're seeing, for example, in the UK, could be quite interesting. I feel the last point in this, our next generation community talked to us about this sense of fairness and the intergenerational divide that is also there that we must address if we're going to make sure that we head forward together.
And the reason why I mentioned the young and youth consumers is because a lot of the companies that we speak to at Bloomberg, they actually say it's a market that's very hard to read, because you want to be like Greta, but also have a life like Kylie Jenner. So it's very difficult to figure out what is it that they want. And actually, a lot of it seems to be, in some ways, empty words. I'm not sure if you would agree, but I have heard a lot of companies say it's a space that's very hard to navigate. So.
Well, if you are a young person who is looking at your future, where can you actually make decisions? Where can you get involved where your views are heard over and over again, rather than just having to go and strike on the street? And I think it's, how does civil society embrace so that there is a voice, so that you can make your voice heard beyond voting, beyond your wallet? How do we actively bring younger people into the decision-making that is happening about their future?
And you mentioned crypto before. I'm sure if we mention crypto, we're going to go completely viral, and then everyone's going to start talking about this. I wonder if you have any thoughts on it, or do you want it to? Well,
more on digital. I mean, I think that the Fridays for the Future movement was very much a reaction to the kind of rubbish generation that came before in terms of not having fought the climate fight as it should have been fought. I think what the youth, coming back to your point about the youth, need to be on the front line defining the battle around data. As Shoshana Zuboff in her great book, Surveillance Capitalism, says, you think you're searching Google for free? Well, guess what? Google's searching you for free. And there's all this data now, with Frances Haugen's also testimony to the Senate, just how there's knowledge that a lot of how we are governing data and allowing, data to be sold is also kind of feeding off of anxieties, for example, amongst young teenage girls. I've got 3 young teenage girls, also a boy, and they and their friends are being constantly searched. And anorexia, bulimia, self-harm is related to how you are made to feel also increasingly anxious with social media. And so there's all sorts of ways that we could be governing that, but I do think there's an opportunity for the youth to be defining that, to be on the front lines, and we follow. And just one last thing in terms of social movements, because there's student movements, but there's also, the labor movement. We should talk about that. Like, the labor share of global income is at the lowest it's ever been, basically, in modern day capitalism. That's not because labor became less productive and capital became smarter. There's been huge amounts of extraction. And I think the fact that, labor unions have to modernize too.
Correct.
And the just transition is a great concept, but again, that's kind of just reacting to making sure that a green transition is just by investing in workers' skills to adapt. But labor's voice should also be at the table ex ante. What does green mean? Who defines it? Is it just a small elite group like this, or does it become a contested terrain? We should probably.
And Rachel, you're I'm going to give you 2 questions straight, so don't worry. So first of all, before you talked about, and following up on the point that Mariana made about data, you mentioned that earlier in your introduction. What is it about data? Is it about the way we consume it, or is it about, as Mariana mentioned, you almost have to own it, realize that in a way it's yours. It's your currency and it's your power too.
Yeah, so I think data, to some extent, the view that data is the new oil has maybe gone a little bit too far.
You don't agree with that?
With the current view, what we're learning in the last few weeks is that oil is actually quite important.
Good point.
But data is also really important. I think for me, one of the key things that we underestimate in data is using data to really hone what is the most effective thing for governments to do. So we have a huge number of challenges in front of us, and we can all list off many things that we would like governments to focus on. We want them to help with innovation. We want them to help with a just transition. We want them to help with inequality. But all of these challenges, we are going to have to prioritize what we focus on. And data can really help us there, and we need to use it to help us do, focus our resources on the most cost-effective way to achieve inequality, to reduce inequality, to achieve our climate goals, and that's where I feel we're not making anything like the progress we need to make.
Because you feel it's overcrowded, because you feel there's too much and we're looking at too many different things?
Because I think that, people say things that, have catchy titles or, sound good, but we need to test them and make sure whether they really work before we invest large amounts of money. So we've talked about the importance of going to scale, and I absolutely agree with that. But before we go to scale with innovations that are designed to help people, we should rigorously test to see whether they actually do achieve the claims that that people make about.
And is data perhaps a way to find that premium? Before we're talking about with both Annan and Robert, that it's that premium that has to be identified in terms of what the consumer wants, but also perhaps where the attention is. Should we be, or can we make a much better use of data to identify that?
We can make we can make a better use of data for targeting our resources in where they will make the biggest impact. So I've been involved in a lot of work, for example, on looking at what's the most effective way to reduce poverty around the world. And a lot of the things that people thought were being very effective, like microcredit, turned out not to be effective. And other things that people thought weren't very useful turned out, like quotas for women in India, women politicians, turned out to be incredibly effective. So until we rigorously look at the issues and test them, we won't know where to focus our resources.
And it kind of goes back to a conversation that I had with going back to Ukraine. Of course, this is all in the context of this, and it would be almost, not fair to not bring this up considering the situation. But I did have a conversation with a Ukrainian official who said when it comes to perhaps even sending help to Ukraine, a lot of the stuff that was being sent was not useful. There was no analysis behind it. If anything, the supply chain is becoming overcrowded and none of this is effective. We can't deliver it. So that would have been an actual good, effective use of data in a real life scenario.
One thing, a lot of people, when they see a situation like Ukraine, want to send toys, or they want to send blankets, or they want to send food, and then nobody can distribute it. And again, the data has shown that it's much more effective to send cash. And we are starting to change how we help people by sending them cash.
We're running out of time. I can never but before we get to the final conclusions, and I think you wanted to add something on this before, that premium of consumers and what it's kind of defined by, or should be defined by?
You can, if you want to pose the question again, I can
So
answer
before,
that.
when we talked about the premium, you said, yeah, there is a premium that perhaps consumers are willing to pay, but they don't know how to navigate what that premium is, or it's very difficult for us to present it at times to the consumer.
I think really sustainable should be the default. You know,
Okay.
what we're looking at here is how do we get over a tipping point, a specific point in time, and you know that is, you know, so should consumers have to pay more for a product which is actually better for the environment and for society? This is where you get really interesting ideas like the true value of food. You know, if the problem is that the food as it is currently priced doesn't incorporate externalities. We're totally ignoring the reality of the situation, and it distorts. You know, forget about subsidies being the distorting. You know, the entire system is distorted as a result. The thing is, we need to. So, you know, in the future, we really should be looking towards how is sustainable the default option. That is entirely doable. The question is this sort of transition period, and you know. Back to that point about net zero, there are a number of us, perhaps in high-income countries, who can be doing more to make that transition happen faster. And it needs to happen really fast, because if we do that now, we're not going to be paying for it later on.
And we're running out of time, but I want to put the last question to all of you. Given the context that we're in, do you fear, however, that a lot of this is going to get sidetracked again? Or is really the momentum behind it strong enough that you're able to perhaps cater to two different crises?
Well, we have many crises: financial, health, climate, now geopolitical. And I just want to come back to a point about capacity. When you don't have the capacity, literally the dynamic capabilities within governments, none of those crises can be governed in a proactive way. It's always reactive. And, you know, coming back to data, the mayor of Barcelona actually hired hackers into her city team in order to govern data and the kind of the data commons. They didn't bring in PwC or Deloitte. And so there is a bit of this over-outsourcing of knowledge by governments into the consulting sector, which I think should be priority in the next gen EU. All that money, as Linda was saying, might not get spent. It probably won't get spent because there's no capability for implementing. And that's a huge problem.
Maria is already avoiding to look at me, and I can see why. Are you ready for a one-word question last round?
One final question.
One-word question last round.
And he will get it, his final word.
Da, 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 da.
We absolutely are missing the opportunity to continue to accelerate the change here. And yes, we are at risk. This group and groups like it have to make sure this stuff stays on the agenda, and we bring in more stakeholders to actually accelerate the change. They've got the power in their hands. We got to make sure they use it.
Well, thank you so much. And we're a little bit late, but I'm sure you're going to forgive us.